history of the camera goes back for many, many, many years. And it's something that we actually take for granted for nowadays because we've even got them on our smartphones. But have you ever wondered where it all began? Greetings all, and today is a bit of a history lesson of the history of the camera. This is going way, way back, and pretty much guaranteed earlier than you actually thought. So we're going to go right the way back from the beginning, right the way up to the present day. The pinhole camera is a camera without a lens, but instead a tiny hole that lets light pass through, inverted and projected on the back of the box. This is also known as the camera obscura effect. Some of the earliest references to the camera obscura was from a Chinese philosopher called Mozi and Greek philosopher Aristotle, which was about 300 BCE to 600 CE. The idea of the pinhole camera goes back to ancient times, when philosophers like Mozi and Aristotle observed how light passing through a small opening could create a projection of the sun or a scene on the ground or a wall. The first person to actually study the pinhole camera scientifically was Ibn al-Haytham, who experimented with different size and shape of holes and explained the linearity of light and the inverted image formation. The pinhole camera actually became the basics for development of the photographic camera in the 19th century, when chemicals and materials that could capture and fix the image were discovered. The first photograph taken with a pinhole camera was made by Sir William Cooke in 1859. The pinhole camera is still used today by hobbyists and enthusiasts who appreciate the simplicity, low cost and artistic effects. The first photographic camera was invented by a French inventor called Joseph Nicephore Niepce in 1816. He was fascinated by the camera obscura. He wanted to find a permanent way of capturing the image. So he experimented with different materials that would react to light to create a permanent image. And he found a substance called bitumen of Judea, which is a kind of asphalt that would harden when exposed to light but stay soft when it was dark. He coated a piece of pewter with this substance and placed it inside a small box with a tiny hole. He then pointed this box at his window and left it to expose for 8 hours. 8 hours. He then washed this plate with a solvent that produced the actual image of his window. And this was the first permanent photo in history. He called this process heliograph, which means sunwriting. The photograph that he did take was very blurry and it was pretty dark. However, it did show the outline of the window and the building, and he named it View from the Window at Le Gras. And this image is now on display in the University of Texas in Austin. And Niepce continued to improve this technique, and he collaborated with another inventor, Louis Daguerre, and together they developed a new process that used silver plates instead of the pewter, and this reduced the exposure time to just a few minutes. They used a mercury vapour to expose the image and then washed it with a salt water. They called this process daguerreotype and became the first commercial photographic camera in 1839. Photographic film was a strip or sheet of a transparent plastic coated with a light sensitive layer of silver halide crystals. When the film is exposed to the light from the camera, it creates a latent image that can be developed into a visible photograph. But how did film come to be? Well, before film there was photographic plates. These were mainly glass sheets covered with various different chemicals, but these plates were bulky, fragile and very, very expensive, and they had to be prepared and developed on the spot. They were then not really good for using outside of an actual studio. The first person to invent a flexible and rollable film was George Eastman, who was an American inventor. He was originally inspired by the dry plate process, which he used gelatin instead of a plate for the process. He experimented with different types of paper and plastic to create a windable spool that was then placed in a light-proof box. In 1885, he presented his first film, which was made of paper coated in gelatine and a silver bromide. And he also designed a very simple to use camera that would hold his film. And do you actually know what the camera was actually called? Come on, have a guess. Yep, the Kodak camera. He actually marketed this camera with the slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." The camera came preloaded with enough film for 100 exposures. And after the film was used up, the whole camera was sent back to the factory. The film was then processed and reloaded with fresh film. The Kodak camera was a huge success, and it made photography accessible and affordable to everyone. However, Eastman's paper film had quite a few drawbacks. It was not very transparent and had to be stripped from the paper base before printing. It also tended to curl at the edges and tear pretty easy. He found a solution in celluloid, a material that was invented by John Wesley Hatt in 1869. Celluloid was made up of nitrocellulose and camphor, and in 1889 Eastman introduced his new film, which this film was much more transparent and very durable. And Eastman's celluloid film became the standard film for the next 6 decades, until it was replaced by more safer and stable materials. And today's photographic film is still used by many hobbyist enthusiasts who appreciate its aesthetic and nostalgic qualities. TLR and SLR cameras are both reflex cameras, meaning they use a mirror system to reflect light passing through the lens to the viewfinder and onto the film. This allows photographers to actually see exactly what it is that they're looking at, and this helps to compose the image. However, they do differ on how many lenses that the camera has and how they work. I'm actually pretty fortunate because I do have a TLR camera here, and as you can see, this has 2 lenses. The top one is for the viewfinder. This is what you're going to see, and the second lens is the one that is going to take the image. The top lens has got a mirror at a 45-degree angle, so the light passing through will then display upwards. So you would actually compose the image by looking down and then taking the photo. To focus and compose the shot, we've got the dial on the side, and if we can get close enough, you can see that when you actually turn, both lenses move at the same time. This one takes a 120mm film, which you can still buy today. So the SLR cameras, which are probably more of what we are used to today, but in the digital format, we'll talk about that in a minute. But SLR cameras only have one lens and a mechanism inside that will move a mirror out of the way, allowing the light to hit the film at the back, or in the case of digital, the sensor. The light would pass through the lens at a 45-degree mirror through a prism and then to a viewfinder, which was always at eye level. One of the benefits of the SLR over the TLR was the viewfinder itself, as the TLRs had what they called a parallax error, which basically meant that what you were viewing to what the photograph was going to be was slightly different at very close shooting. But SLR cameras did have their own little drawback, which most of us actually got used to and didn't really bother, which was called the mirror slap. When you press the button, you don't just hear a click of the shutter opening and closing. You also had the slap of the mirror moving out of the way and then flipping back. And SLRs also had a viewfinder blackout. This was the point where the photograph was taken, where the mirror would move out of the way, causing the viewfinder to, well, not see anything. A digital camera, instead of capturing the image on a film, would actually capture the image digitally. Over the years, this was stored on various different devices, and believe it or not, some of the first ones was actually stored on cassette tape. And to start with, most of the digital cameras were very bulky, very expensive, and sometimes pretty difficult to use. The first digital camera was invented by Stephen Sayson, who was an engineer at Kodak in 1975. He built a prototype from a movie camera lens, some Motorola parts and 16 batteries, and he used a new type of sensor, the CCD, charged coupled device. The camera was the size of a toaster and weighed 8 pounds. Can you imagine taking that thing? And it could also only take, at the time, black and white images. The resolution was 0.01 of a megapixel and stored the images on a cassette tape. But it also took 23 seconds to capture one image. But this camera was a groundbreaking innovation. But unfortunately, it wasn't a commercial success because Kodak feared that this camera would interfere with its film business, and so it never was made publicly available. The first digital camera made available to the public was the Sony Mavica. This was introduced in 1981. The Mavica stood for Magnetic Video Camera, and it used a magnetic disc to store the images. But the images were not digital, they were actually analog, and the resolution was only 0.3 of a megapixel. But the camera was also very expensive, costing at the time $2,500. You're going to have to do the conversion from dollars to pounds if you want to, because all the information I'd found, everything was all in dollars. Yeah. The first true consumer digital camera was the Dicom Model 1, which was also known as the Logitech Photoman. This was launched in 1990. It used a CCD sensor and a digital memory card to store the images. It had a resolution of 0.3 megapixels and a fixed focus length. It could store up to 32 images, but could be connected to a computer via a serial cable. And this camera at the time cost $1,000. The first digital camera that became popular amongst its consumers was the Apple QuickTake 100, and that was released in 1994. It was the first camera designed to work with the home computer, and it had a user-friendly design and software. It had a resolution of 0.3 megapixels, but it had a built-in flash. You could download images onto a Mac via a cable, and this cost $750. The first digital camera that used the JPEG format was the Kodak DC-40. This was launched in 1995. It was also the first camera to use the compact flash card to store its images. It had a resolution of 0.4 megapixels and a fixed focal lens. The first digital camera that had over 1 megapixel resolution was the Nikon D1. This was launched in 1999, and it became really popular because it used the Nikon's F mount. And this was really good news because it meant that people could use the lenses that they had from their older film cameras. The resolution was 2.7 megapixels and a very fast autofocus system. It could store up to 21 images on a compact flash card, and it could also be connected to a PC via a USB cable. But this was very expensive at $6,000. So as you can see, the first digital cameras are not what we were used to today. They were still very bulky and very expensive. Many manufacturers quickly switched from SLRs to DSLRs, as the process of just having a sensor instead of a film was a lot easier than actually having to redesign a whole new camera. This brings us up to the present day, where mirrorless cameras are pretty much what we're all used to. Your smartphone is actually a mirrorless camera. So the switch from your DSLRs to mirrorless is actually a lot simpler now because of technology's advancement. And manufacturers found it a lot cheaper and easier to build a mirrorless camera because of removing the complex mirror systems that was used basically just to compose the image. But as we could design very small screens, the viewfinder just changed. To see what it is that you're composing, a very small basically screen was used in its place. So this basically reduced the weight of the camera, but it's also made possible a lot of other features as well. As you probably know, is live view on cameras. I mean, it's like now, I can see what I'm recording on my camera as it's actually happening. Now this was possible on DSLRs, but the only thing is you had to remove the mirror out of the way. But this meant, as I spoke to before, about the black spot on the viewfinder. once that mirror's out of the way, the viewfinder itself is actually pointless. Now you may be saying, but if you're going to be watching a live view, why do you want to see the viewfinder? Well, believe it or not, there are certain circumstances where you're still going to need both. But it's also brought some other features as well, which were not possible on the DSLRs. And this is simply because the sensor itself is used for quite a lot of the things that we basically are taking for granted, like face tracking, eye movement. All of these things were not possible on a DSLR, unless on some of them you actually put it in live view. So you're removing the mirror actually out of the way. So if that's the case, why have the mirror? And that's the point where we're at today. Mirrorless cameras, they are the future. What's going to be beyond that? Who knows? But for me personally, I can't see at the moment that mirrorless cameras are going to be disappearing anytime soon. And I think they're going to be around for many, many years. So there we have it, the history of the camera. It started as just a small tiny pinhole in a box to what we have today. And yes, we've got people who still use these older technologies because, well, why not? I'm sure that they are fascinating in their own way. And it's like myself with the TLR. I am going to use it one day, though to be fair, it's mainly just going to be just a bit of a showpiece and a collector's item. Anyway, I hope you found this useful and interesting, and because to be fair, doing all the research for this, I actually found it pretty interesting myself and I learned quite actually a bit. So I hope you found it useful, and give us that thumbs up, hit the subscribe, and you're going to see more of me. So till the next time, thanks for joining me, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.